Good morning, dear students. Once again, welcome back to the YouTube classroom. This video lesson is actually a continuation of our three previous sessions on the novel The French Lieutenant's Woman. So this is the fourth session on The French Lieutenant's Woman. In this session, we are analyzing the different themes in the novel The French Lieutenant's Woman. There are lots of themes the novel deals with, like the artificial nature of fiction, freedom, love and sex, gender, scientific progress and discovery, mystery and uncertainty, duty, social mobility and revolution, etc. So first of all, let's look into the theme, the artificial nature of fiction. Novels traditionally try to convince us to suspend our disbelief and plunge ourselves into the narrated world so that we come to sympathize with the characters as real people going through real trials and tribulations. But the unconventional novel, The French Lieutenant's Woman, constantly reminds us that it is exactly an imaginary work of fiction, which makes the readers feel that they are reading something which never happened in reality. Charles is a despiser of novels because he likes to view himself as a rational and scientific man. In contrast, Sarah's ex-employer, Mrs. Talbot, she reads highly sentimental and melodramatic romantic literature that has nothing to do with reality. The author's frequent interferences on the narrative that keep reminding us that there is a consciousness behind this novel. The author keeps on telling us that it is a work of art or a piece of fiction that was artificially produced according to the conventions of writing. Through the multiple ending techniques and the narrator's coin flipping to choose between two alternate endings, Fowles makes it impossible for the readers to suspend their disbelief. We are provided with two endings between which the narrator flips a coin to choose which goes first. The two endings directly contradict each other. The author even brings the element of the supernatural into the novel when he takes out his watch and rewinds it to allow the second ending to occur, and thereby reminds us that we are reading a fictitious story far from the real. While talking about the theme of freedom, Fowles writes in the Aristos that if we strive to be free, the terms of existence encourage us to change, to evolve. This dominant theme in his works becomes most apparent in The French Lieutenant's Woman. Each character in the novel is constrained in some way by Victorian society. Ernestina experiences no freedom since she does not allow this evolution. Her nature is actually not strong enough to stand up to the conventions of her world and take a more active part in the determination of her future. Ernestina has never been encouraged to explore her sexuality, and so she is afraid of any intimacy with Charles. As a result, Charles gravitates to Sarah, who exhibits a more sensual nature. Sarah manages to break out of this narrow social world to some extent because she intentionally chooses to go against what is acceptable and thereby ejects herself from the social sphere, essentially becoming an outcast or pariah. Sarah says that she owed it to herself to appear a mistress of her destiny. But not all the characters feel free to act on the world around them. Although a scientific theory, Darwinism also can be interpreted philosophically. It implies determinism and thereby denying freedom. The scientific theory, Darwinism, that itself denies freedom. because it is based on the idea of determinism. What actually Darwinism says, it says that we are what we are because of millions of years of evolution. So to think that our actions are the products of our own unique consciousness and will is a delusion, because Darwinism says that we are what we are because of millions of years of evolution. So evolution plays the key role, not our own unique consciousness or will. Charles thinks that he has total free will, and it is on this assumption that he congratulates himself for his own behavior. But there are instances in the novel where Charles realizes that his free will has nothing to do with his fate. Charles's deep fear is that he is the human equivalent of an ammonite stranded in a drought, stuck in time, helpless in the face of fate and forces beyond his control. The novel itself is marked with its severe criticism of the strict Victorian society, which interferes in all spheres of individual freedom. The Victorian era was a socially restrictive period, and one of the main conflicts of this novel involves the characters struggling against the social conventions that keep them bound to certain pathways in life. Charles and Sarah share the goal of finding a way to live as they wish in their society, and they constantly fight against the restrictions they find imposed on their free will. Love and sex are treated from an almost sociological perspective in this novel. Through his descriptions of the attitudes of various characters in the novel towards sex, the author hopes to create a portrait of Victorian sexuality. When we think of the Victorians, we tend to think of an extreme prudery. In fact, the adjective Victorian is basically synonymous with puritanical censure of sexual activity and feelings. The fact that Sarah has such a bad reputation because of her rumored sexual encounters is a product of this Victorian prudery. And the lack of sexual contact between the lovers Charles and Ernestina is another result of the Victorian denial and willful ignoring of sex. However, Fowles shows us in the novel that Victorian prudery is more complicated than we might initially think. It isn't by any means universal, and it depends heavily on class and gender. Denial of sexual feelings and interactions is primarily the business of the upper classes. Charles and Ernestina have been taught to suppress their sexual instincts for their whole lives, and this proves a problem when they are trying to embark on a romantic relationship together. Physical contact between them is unnatural and forced, as in the scene following their engagement when we expect them to be thrilled to finally be allowed to kiss each other. Ernestina ends up crying. The narrator explains that they did not kiss. The lower classes seem to take a healthier view of sex, or at least a less repressed one. Mary incarnates female sexual attractiveness, and she invites male provocation and enjoys being looked at and flirted with. Premarital sex is much more common and even accepted in the lower classes, although it ends in disaster as often as it does in a marriage. Fowles has built science into the fabric of the French leftist woman. The concept at the center of the novel is Darwinism. Darwinism claims that species evolve over time by a process of natural selection. The individuals in a species who are best adapted to their environment's changing conditions survive and reproduce. And eventually, their genes become dominant in the gene pool of that particular species. This was a very controversial theory at the time. In chapter 1, Ernestina's father and Charles quarrel upon the idea of human descending from monkeys. Charles is a scientist and an amateur paleontologist. Darwinism was one of the main threats to Victorian society. It is ironic that Charles, who is such a Victorian gentleman, should be a supporter of Darwin. Its implications menace the fabric of respectability that the Victorians so value. The narrator of the novel notes that Darwinism could lead to a way of looking at the world in which morality is reduced to hypocrisy and duty to a straw hut in a hurricane. Charles initially thinks of himself as the naturally selected and appreciates the explanation that Darwinism seems to give for his heightened social status. He is simply the fittest, the smartest, and the most suited to be on the top of the social pyramid. Later, though, Charles begins to doubt whether this is true. When he is actually in nature, Charles feels excommunicated, not like a fit example of life. In different interviews, Fowles has expressed various views on scientific progress. In a Paris Review interview, he highlights the importance of Darwinian thought in the Victorian age. According to him, this was when rational science began at last to cast off the shackles of obscurantist religion, when reason began to triumph over myth. In a BBC interview in 1977, Fowles cast doubt on the ability of science to answer all our questions. He says that to think that science has solved all our problems is just an illusion, and that science will never be able to explain everything. Mystery is a major theme of The French Lieutenant's Woman. The novel emphasizes the importance of mystery in an age where science can't quite give us all the answers to the questions we really care about. Sarah in the novel is a personification of mystery. Initially, the reader cannot even tell what gender she is, and it takes a few chapters for us to learn her real name. It's only when she has sex with Charles that we do realize that she was a virgin. And we never seem to learn her true motives for having acted as she has. Sarah has darker qualities. She is always dressed in black, and when Charles sees her, he describes her as a dark movement in his field of vision. She contrasts strongly in this way to Ernestina, who often appears in pretty light-colored dresses. And Ernestina has no real secrets to hide. Sarah's mysterious nature is certainly part of her attraction. Charles is fascinated by her unpredictability. At the close of the novel's first ending, Charles asks Sarah, "Shall I ever understand?" And Sarah shakes her head. She is never meant to be understood. When he is separated from her, he slowly realizes that he can't really tell the difference between the real Sarah and the Sarah he had created in so many such dreams. The dark side of mystery in The French Lieutenant's Woman is deception and concealment. At the end of the novel's second ending, Charles comes to the conclusion that life is not one riddle. This is an incredibly important realization for him to have. He has spent so long trying to unlock Sarah's mysteries, thinking that to do so would give him the key to a happy and fulfilled life. And here he realizes that there is no quick fix and no one riddle to solve that will give him the secret meaning of life. Even though he was happy chasing the illusion that mystery would bring him happiness, he was ultimately deluded. Life is meant to be endured, not solved. Duty is described by the narrator of The French Lieutenant's Woman as a uniquely Victorian trait that creates the order and morality that the Victorians so valued. Duty, rather than passion, is the motivating force behind many of the characters and behind the era as a whole. All the characters seem to experience the sense of duty, except for the modern woman Sarah, who is motivated by passion rather than duty. Ernestina feels the burden of the bestial duty to have sex with one's husband as a payment for all the enjoyable things that marriage brings. Uncle Robert expects Charles to be more dutiful toward him as a father figure. Mrs. Pulteney feels a duty to give charity, although her charity must necessarily be false and hollow with duty as its primary motivator, and it is not an adequate substitute for compassionate morality. Charles feels a very strong sense of duty to many things. He feels a duty towards Ernestina, which requires him to spend time with her and make sure that he follows the proper conventions that an engagement requires of him. Even though he is merely a scientific amateur, Charles feels a duty towards the pursuit of scientific knowledge also. Throughout the novel, Charles experiences a loss of sense of duty, although he keeps trying to hold on to it as a justification for what he does. The tragedy of Charles, he says, is that he no longer feels any real sense of duty to anything, and this makes him lack a moral purpose. In the scene in the church, after he has sex with Sarah, Charles tells himself that duty requires him to go back to Ernestina and fulfill his engagement vows to her. However, his better self knows that duty is but a pot that can hold either evil or good, and that duty isn't necessarily good. Duty is not an objective value to strive forward. Charles has been willfully misinterpreting it and clinging on to the idea of duty. It is rather a prison in which Charles is comfortably safe and feels no urge to leave, because what is outside the prison is too frightening to contemplate. This ridiculous attempt to hold on to duty is what distinguishes Charles from a modern man, who understands that there are more important things in life than duty. The major themes of the novel are all interlinked in some way or the other, and the theme of social class and the changing social situation in Victorian England is intimately bound up with Darwinist thought. Charles can recognize that he lives in an era of change. He exclaims to himself that his time is such an age of change in which so many orders are beginning to melt and dissolve. He cannot act on this knowledge and adapt himself to the new social order. Other classes are able to make the most of the changing times and begin to rise through the ranks of society. Charles believes in Darwinism, and he believes that he can apply its principles of natural selection and survival of the fittest to his own life. Throughout the beginning of the novel, he refers to himself as being the naturally selected. However, the events and the commentary of the French lieutenant seem to suggest that Charles is deluding himself. He is on top of the metaphorical food chain in Victorian England, but is incapable of the sort of change that is necessary for survival in his rapidly changing environment. His rejection of Mr. Freeman's proposal of partnership in his father-in-law's business is an example for this. He feels that it's not suitable for a gentleman to go into trade. In the later part of the novel, the social class of Charles is being compared to the species of dinosaurs, the ancient saurian species. That means the species of Charles will soon be a relic of a bygone era. Means the social class, they will lose their place in the social system. The aristocratic people will lose their standard, their social standard in the future. Who will replace him? That's the question. There is a sort of class revolution going on, a competition going on. The novel shows that change happening in the society. The novel represents three sections or classes of people who strive to maintain or improve their social status. Two of them, means the bourgeois class and the lower classes, are trying to improve their social standard, while the other class, means the aristocratic people like Charles are trying to maintain their top position in the social strata. The nouveau riche or the bourgeois class is represented by the Freeman family. That means Ernestina Freeman, her father, and her family. Characters like Sam and Mary represent the lower classes. They were also trying to improve their social standard or come up in the strata of the social hierarchy. The novel also discusses some other minor themes like the theme of emancipation, storytelling and morality, fiction and history versus Fowles reality, paints the Victorian era as a time of great social and on the top of the social hierarchy.